Thank you so much for this honor. So I am going to start with a classic teacher move. I'm going to activate some prior knowledge. So I'd like everybody to take a moment and think back to when you were in middle school and high school in history class. And I want you to think about what you learned about the Vietnam War. What did you learn about the Vietnam War when you were in middle and high school? Not enough. Now raise your hand if you thought of either the Secret War or the Hmong in your answer. He's my husband, he doesn't count. But that's what I thought. Nobody raised their hand. Me either. When I first became a teacher, graduating with degrees from both Notre Dame and Vanderbilt, I did not know about the Secret War. So I launched into teaching the Vietnam War, much as I'm sure many of you learned about it. And my second year teaching, I was launching into the causes of the Vietnam War, some scintillating topic like that, when one of my students, Diplai, raised her hand, and she said, "Miss Kourajian, when are you going to start teaching about us? When are you going to start teaching about us?" Now, Diplai is Hmong, an ethnic minority from Laos, and in her question, I heard her asking, when are you going to start teaching a history that I see myself reflected in and that I see my community reflected in? I didn't have a good answer for Diplai that day, so I completely bluffed and said, "That is a great question. That's actually our lesson for tomorrow. Hang tight, and we'll talk about it tomorrow." And that day, after teaching a full day and then coaching Quiz Bowl in the afternoon, I went home and I spent hours reading up on the Secret War to prepare a totally different lesson for the next day. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Secret War was a war fought in Laos during the final years of the Vietnam War. It was orchestrated by the United States CIA, but in order to keep it secret, instead of using American soldiers, the CIA recruited Hmong boys and men to fight this war. When the United States lost the Vietnam War and North Vietnam won, the US evacuated its operatives and top Hmong generals, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of Hmong men, women, and children who were immediately targeted by the North Vietnamese for having aided the Americans in the war. The Hmong fled en masse across the Mekong River into Thailand, where many waited for up to 20 years for resettlement into the United States. Today, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where I live, has the largest Hmong population in the entire world, the largest urban Hmong population in the entire world. And my students are the grandchildren of these brave soldiers and refugees, and they know their stories. They are proud of their stories. By neglecting to teach the history of the Hmong and the Secret War in my teaching of the Vietnam War, I was not only robbing my Hmong students from the opportunity to see themselves in our curriculum, but I was also robbing our non-Hmong students from the chance to learn about their classmates, those in their community, and this part of American history that, as this room can attest, is not often taught in our schools today. Diplai changed my teaching with her question that day. Very narrowly, I started teaching the Vietnam War from the perspective of the Hmong, and I use story cloths and oral histories as our primary source documents for that unit. But more broadly, she helped shape my two-pronged approach to education. The first prong of that is I truly believe it is the duty of every single teacher to ensure that their students are present and seen and heard in the classroom and in the curriculum. For me as a history teacher, this means specifically learning the history of the communities from which my students come, like the Hmong, among others, and ensuring that they are prioritized in our curriculum and not just side dishes to the main entree of white American history. In order to do this, I think it is essential that history teachers ditch the textbook, not just supplement it, but ditch it. I have exactly 2 textbooks in my classroom, and they are both used to prop up my laptop. That's the best use I have for them. Textbooks tell a singular story. It is a story that very rarely represents the students in my classroom, and really they're boring. I teach 13-year-olds. It is hard to get 13-year-olds excited about history using a textbook. So that's the first part of my approach to teaching. The second part of my belief and approach to teaching is that history education needs to focus on skills, not memorization. I truly do not care if my students memorize dates. We all have computers in our pockets. That information is available. The history classes that I took in middle and high school focused on memorization, and I didn't like it. So with my students, we instead focus on historical thinking skills. These include learning how to analyze primary and secondary source documents, how to contextualize them, how to identify bias in both historical documents and modern day resources, and then also how to develop a historical argument and support it with evidence. These are the skills that my students need not only to be successful as they go on in high school and college, but also to be critical thinking members of our community who are able to identify bias in sources and come to conclusions based on evidence. You might think from how I talk about history that I loved history when I was a student, but I absolutely hated it because it was boring and devoid of women. But I always knew that I wanted to be in education because as a very nerdy kid from a low-income background, I saw school as both my favorite place in the entire world and my path to a more stable future. When I came to Notre Dame, I was incredibly lucky to fall under the mentorship of Doctors Stuart Green and Maria McKenna, who helped foster my vocation to public education. With their guidance, I went on to Vanderbilt, to Peabody College at Vanderbilt to earn my Master's of Education and to do my student teaching simultaneously. And after that, I began my career as a middle school social studies teacher. So for those of you who are maybe considering going into education, I hope there are some of you here, there are three main thoughts that I want to leave you with today. The first is I really hope that you consider working in public schools. For all its merits, ACE is not the only path to becoming a teacher coming out of Notre Dame. I am passionate about the mission of public schools to welcome and love and educate every single student who comes through our doors, no matter what, and I am proud to work in the public school system. The second thing I'd like you to remember is that teaching is enough. I cannot tell you how many times in my life I've been asked, you want to be a teacher, and then what? As if teaching can only be a stepping stone into another career in administration or education policy. If you are called to teach, then please teach. I feel called to teach. My goal is to be a classroom teacher for the next 40 years, which is a bit of a revolutionary statement to say coming out of Notre Dame. But in that time, I will have educated over 5,000 individual students. Imagine the impact that somebody can have by loving and learning with and learning from that many children. It is an absolute gift. So if you are called to teach, please teach. And the last thing I want to leave you with is, if you do decide to teach, please listen to your students. Their voices belong in our classrooms, and their stories belong in our curriculum. Dipli and many students like her taught me that students crave a curriculum that is both relevant and personal, and it's the duty of teachers to provide that. As a history teacher, I work every day towards creating both a classroom culture and a curriculum in which every single one of my students sees themselves reflected in the American story. Thank you.